Today's left wing shows little concern for the labor movement and economic theory, unlike Marxists of the last generation. Instead, the left emphasizes cultural change. Changing America's values is seen as the best means for ushering in the socialist utopia. This is why the left today champions any cause that undermines traditional moral and cultural values, and why leftists gravitate to cultural shaping institutions. Education, the arts, and media. Hey, I'm Papa Jobo. Why do I bring that up? Because of this. Disney executives admit they are pushing not at all secret gay agenda, actively removing gender greetings, and a whole lot more. Before we continue, I know many gay people, love and admire them. They're my friends. I don't admire them for their gayness. I admire them because of who they are as humans. I won't say who they are because that's for them to say, not me. The reason I'm bringing it up, though, is because they're trying to use the gay agenda as a means to push communism in this country, cultural Marxism, as we call it. If we go back to this article, it's going to get into what I'm going to talk about specifically, and it's something you should pay attention to because it's happening at warp speed right now, and it is important to understand that people are using you. If you are part of a certain class, a religion, a creed, a political identity, a social identity, you're being used. And unfortunately, people are falling for these very simplistic communist tools that they use to subvert and control a population. I'm going to go back to this article. There are many practical areas in which the legacy of cultural Marxism has found fruition today. One of these is in the network of tendencies that are popularly referred to as political correctness. In his book, The Retreat of Reason, journalist Anthony Brown, who is a very good journalist, gives a concise definition of political correctness. Political correctness, he wrote, is an ideology that classifies certain groups of people as victims in need of protection from criticism. From criticism, that's important because those are just words. And which makes believers feel that no dissent should be tolerated. That's huge. I mean, that's what we're seeing here. You can't dissent to anything, say like to people who oppose a bill that simply protects your child from being sexualized and groomed. Brown rightfully identifies political correctness as a species of cultural Marxism. Instead of merely transferring wealth from the bourgeois to the working class, it's become politically correct for the government to transfer power from the powerful to the powerless, or to groups perceived to be victims. If you're a homosexual, or you are a person who is part of the LGBT alphabet club, if you are a person who is a different color, which, I am, we all are actually people of color. That's kind of the part they don't talk about, is that we're all people of color. Strange, I know. But if you're part of any of these groups that are being identified as the victim class, you have to then get into what Yuri Bezmenov said. And what he said is really simple. A person who is demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell him nothing. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents and pictures, he will refuse to believe it. That's the tragedy of the situation of demoralization. And how are we being demoralized today? By pitting each other against one another for simple things that you could just sit down and talk about civilly. How do you demoralize a country? Well, it's really simple at its core. You use words. If somebody isn't doing something you like, you call them vicious, horrible, ugly names. And as much as people like to say that doesn't matter, it does. A lot of what matters in life is just simple communication. And when you decide to tear people down to the level of being what you would call a bigot or an ist or a phobe, simply for having an opposing point of view and not, by definition, being any of the things you've called them, all you're doing is feeding into the subversion of Western society as outlined by communist propagandists. And that's exactly where we're at. That's where we're at in a society. But let's get back to the Disney story. And I think you'll see how this is happening in our society with a story like this. It's becoming more clear why LGBT activists are angered at the idea of having less access to your children. The war between Disney and the state of Florida has been raging on for weeks, ever since the state announced Florida's parental rights and education bill that bans the teaching of sexual orientation and gender identity to students in kindergarten through third grade. If you don't think that's reasonable, then yes, you are part of what Yuri Bezmenov defined as the useful idiots. Kids don't need to be taught this by teachers. If you want to teach your kids this as a parent, that is up to you. There are some people out there who think that might be bad, but that's for them to think. You can't change everyone's thoughts. But as we move forward with this story, you have to understand that all these people I'm going to mention are activists. And what are activists supposed to do? What is their goal? What is their role in the subversion of society, in propagating cultural Marxism? It's to simply push the many victimhood narratives that you've been taught about in some of the articles I've read you and some of the articles I encourage you to go read on your own. And what they teach is that there is a victim class out there. And when you start to do that, these are the types of people we've allowed to get into power and are now deciding they get to make choices for all of us. And if you don't get on board, then you're called the horrible names. And what happens from there is historically some very bad things. Anyway, let's get into what's happening here. In a video of the meeting that was obtained by journalist Christopher Rufo, Burke spoke on how important it was for her to have many LGBTQIA characters in our stories as the mother of a transgender and pansexual child. So here's the deal. In the past, I never heard anybody at Disney ever say anything bad about anybody who was homosexual or part of that community ever. It was never part of it. So why are they coming out so loud now? Why are they coming out saying things like that? Really simply because they have been adopted into the cult of cultural Marxism, which is just communism, and are now being the useful idiots that we've been taught about. Again, not my words. That's it's a derogatory term, but if there was another word for it, I would use it. But it just gets us to the point a lot quicker. A useful idiot is someone who simply propagates communist propaganda without knowing they're doing it in a lot of cases. And what happens to useful idiots after a communist takeover is that they're almost all summarily executed. And that's just how it goes. If you're part of that agenda, part of this agenda, you really need to look at yourself in the mirror and go, wait, are people who are opposed to this bill really evil, horrible people who are opposed to homosexuality? Most people don't give a damn. They just want to go to a park and enjoy their lives. They don't have to have themselves represented in everything out there. I don't have to have myself represented in anything. I just want to see people act normal without all the fighting and hatred. And this stuff propagates that because what they're doing is saying our group of people needs special attention. And here's why. And then they do that, and then they add on to the end of it, if you don't agree with this, you're a horrible person. And that's the way you get people to start fighting. Simple as that. And that's what this is about. And this part is just scary to me. A Disney production coordinator identified as Alan March, who says he worked on Disney's Moon Girl series, also revealed Disney has actually created a tracker in order to determine whether or not the company is creating enough LGBTQ characters. A tracker? You don't have to track people. You're moving into some sketchy territory there. So I put together a tracker of background characters to make sure that we have the full breadth of expression. We got into a very similar conversation, Carrie, of like, oh, all our gender nonconforming characters are in the background. First of all, listen to how they speak. They're like, oh. These are people who were put into their positions not based upon their merit or their skill or their education level, but upon their activist level. And who cares if you have background characters that are part of that community? I don't care. What I care about is when you try to force it down someone's throat as an activist lesson that we all need to hear, and we don't. I'm telling you right now, I've never seen any sort of horrible thing towards that community at Disney, ever. But this is horrible towards that community because they're patronizing you. They're telling you you're a victim, you can't handle yourself, we need to do this for you. Their goal is to take away individuality and to make sure that everyone becomes part of the cultural Marxist revolution and conforms to one thought. You all have to think the same or you're horrible. So it's not just a numbers game of how many LGBTQ characters you have. The more centered a story is on a character, the more nuance you get to get into their story. Especially with trans characters, you can't see if someone is trans. There's not one way to look trans. So kind of the only way to have these canonical trans characters, canonical asexual characters, canonical blah, blah, blah characters is to give them stories where they can be their whole selves. In other words, we have to show their story and no one else's. By the way, there's not one way of telling what a trans looks like. I would agree with sometimes. I mean, I've been surprised. But other times, yeah, you can. That's fair to say. Nothing wrong with that. And this is the part that really gets me, because in the whole article, this is the part that strikes me as the most dangerous, because you're changing language and verbiage and shaming those, which is part of the subversion of cultural Marxism and communism. You're shaming those who don't believe in what you do and won't speak like you speak. If you have wrong thought or wrong speech, you're a horrible person. But this is the part that freaks me out. A third video shows Vivian Ware, the diversity and inclusion manager at Walt Disney Parks and Resorts, stating, "Last summer we removed all the gendered greetings in relationship to our spiels." Well, what if I want to be called by my gender? It's ridiculous. She explains, so we no longer say ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, which there are many. Statistically speaking, only about 3.8% of the population is part of the LGBT alphabet community. And why should that agenda be pushed to the forefront? Because again, it goes back to the victimhood mentality that one class is a victim and we have to put them forward. And if you don't agree, we're gonna demonize you. But she says, so we no longer say ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We provide training for all of our cast members in relationship to that. So now they say hello, everyone, or hello, friends. That's dangerous. When you decide that certain pronouns and the use of adjectives and verbs and nouns simply can't be used because they offend your activist mindset and ideologies, then the world is going full force and warp speed towards cultural Marxist ideology and communism. We're already there. It's in our institutions. How we let it get there, that's a video for another day, because it would be a long video. This part goes into the paranoia and the mindset that is fed into these groups from the upper echelons. So they're using them as the useful idiots. There's a fourth video, Nadine Smith, the Equality Florida specialist, discussing the Florida bill. We're also reacting from the reality that when they can erase you and they can criminalize your existence, when they can demonize who you are, the next step is to criminalize you and take your kids. And we're already seeing that in Texas. No, you're not. And no one's trying to criminalize you at all. They're simply saying, we don't want you teaching our kids that. I want to be able to if I need to. That's it. Read the bill. You can tell they haven't even read it, or if they have, they are at the top and they're disseminating information which just isn't true. And that's scary. The next step is to criminalize you and take your kids. Point out where that's happening, where if you're not actually abusing or hurting a child, your kid's just magically being taken away. That's not happening. In the end, what this comes down to for me is I think it's really sad to watch our society be turned one against the other. When I go out in my daily life and I interact with people from all walks of life, races, creeds, sexualities, colors, all of it, and I do so civilly and I do so as one human being to another. What I don't do is I don't point out one group and say they need to be treated special, because when you do, you're feeding right into cultural Marxism and Gramsci-style communism. And it's even sadder still that a lot of people don't realize they're doing it and that they are part of the useful idiot class that I bring up a lot. It's something people really need to be educated about and look into, because that whole article could just be an absolute poster child for what I'm talking about. People who have clearly lost their minds. People who have clearly bought into an ideology that is meant to do one thing: divide and destroy. Well, I guess that's more than one thing, but it is meant to hurt us. It is meant to divide us. It is meant to destroy us. If you don't believe it, please just go educate yourself. I try to read you as much as I can here on it. I could do 5-hour videos on this stuff to teach you guys this stuff. It's your responsibility to go do it, I believe. I've genuinely been worried about the direction this country's going in for about 25 years now when I first started learning about this stuff. But now that the internet's around, there's really no excuse not to know about it, to not educate yourself about it, to not go and look into it. This is real. I have people tell me when I talk about it sometimes, oh, it's kind of conspiratorial. The biggest government on earth is communist. And when I say communism, how can you think that's conspiratorial? Think about that for a second. It is exactly what I'm talking about, the subversion of society through education, the arts, and media. And a huge part of that are the uneducated, the misinformed, the people who have problems with substance abuse and things like that, using them as, again, the useful idiots. Not my words, the Soviet propagandist words. Is that, like I said, I would change it if I could, but it gets us right to the point, doesn't it? So where do we go from here in a time when, I'll be honest with you, I feel helpless at times with it. I can talk about it all I want, but a lot of these people aren't buying into it because the propaganda is that strong from the left. If you think this way, you are this. People are very, very scared of being called names. For a lot of us, it just falls on deaf ears now because we've been called those names for a long, long time. Or I should say a lot of other people have. I haven't, because I haven't been out in the public eye really at all in my life. I was an extra in some movies when I was younger, so I guess there's that. But now that I'm out here talking about this stuff, I'm sure some of the feedback I get will be from people who haven't been red-pilled. But I keep talking about it because I want to see our society change and become whole again. Anyway, what do you think about this whole mess? What do you think about this whole fiasco? What do you think about people at high levels of a major company bowing down to this sort of activist nonsense? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm going to leave you with some words of hope, hopefully, and that is to keep fighting with, our words and our minds, and keep trying to wake people up to this, because it is happening. And there are some days where it seems like it's not, and then there's some days where it seems like it's really working. We need to keep doing that. I'm Joe from Papa Joe Bows. Peace.